So recently, Alex O'Connor, a YouTube atheist better known as Cosmic Skeptic, recently appeared in a Jubilee video with an astonishing 4.1 million views, in which he debates 25 Christians. Although the video has received largely negative reviews from the apologetics community because of the format of the dialogue not really giving these 25 Christians enough time to fully flesh out their points, I personally think this video still has this amazing outcome of allowing lesser-known apologists to showcase their thoughtful critiques of Alex's arguments, which not only elevates their platforms, but also presents a young, energetic, and intelligent face of Christianity to the wider public, even though they were kind of in the company of less philosophically sophisticated Christians and, yes, even Mormons. Yeah. So this video is going to focus on assessing the specific dialogue between Alex and his second challenger, a guy named Tim Howard. So Tim is a young Christian apologist with a YouTube channel called Doxastic Mastery, which focuses on arguments for God's existence and the problem of evil. I hadn't heard of Tim prior to his appearance in this Jubilee video, but I was very impressed with his depth of knowledge about the problem of evil and his preparation for this exchange with Alex. So right off the bat, Tim gets Alex to specify the exact kind of suffering that he takes issue with and thinks is incompatible with God's existence. And Alex here clarifies that his main problem is with animal suffering. So he elaborates and says that, animal suffering is a particularly difficult problem for Christians because the usual theodicies or explanations that are offered to justify God's permitting of suffering, they usually involve things like free will or soul building or other kinds of goods, and these don't really apply that well to animals. You might think that animals don't really have free will, or they don't have souls, or their souls don't go to heaven. And there's also the fact that, animals have been around for millions of years before humans even hit the scene. And so, there's a whole lot of time where animals are dying of disease and predation, and it's having no impact on humans whatsoever. And so the question there is, why would a good and loving God create a world where this kind of suffering is just baked into the existence of animals, into the very lives of these animals in nature? And Tim's response here is actually quite excellent. He begins by asking if, Alex has heard of what he calls the axiological expectation mismatch problem. And, this gets a couple chuckles from the audience because these are big words. And, in terms of debate tactics, this move is pretty brilliant for a couple of reasons. So because he's using a bunch of big words, it makes him sound smart. And second, it kind of poses a challenge to Alex. Do you understand what these words mean? Do you understand the concept behind them? And here, Alex kind of just admits, like, yeah, I've never heard of this concept before. And then here, this places Tim at an advantageous position in the dialogue because now he's kind of established himself as the expert, the teacher. He gets to explain to Alex what this axiological expectation mismatch problem is. And then Alex, on the other hand, is the listener. He is the student. And then this kind of, places Tim at a pretty good position in this debate early on. Okay, so what's Tim's purpose in talking about this so-called axiological expectation mismatch problem? So what he wants to do is he wants to set the ground rules for the debate. So he wants to say that the problem of evil arises because of a mismatch in expectations. We kind of expect God to create the world in a certain way. So in this case, to create a world where there's no animal suffering. And yet, we see that in the world, there is animal suffering, a whole lot of it. And so there's a mismatch between what we expect and what we actually see. But here, Tim wants to say that, whether or not there's a mismatch of expectations depends on what conception of God that we envision. And so first, before Alex can critique God, Tim has to first paint a picture of his version or conception of God, his model of God. And then that model has to be assessed for its internal consistency. And that's kind of how Tim wants to set the stage entering into this dialogue. Okay, so this definitely is a valid formulation of the problem of evil, and Alex even agrees. And so he gives Tim the opportunity to explain what his conception of God is. So here, Tim suggests that for him, God is morally justified in permitting animal suffering if the animal looks back on its life in the final stage of its life, which I guess in this case means some kind of afterlife for Tim. If the animal looks back on its earthly life and kind of concludes, yeah, I know that I suffered a lot, but in the end, I wouldn't have had it any other way. I think overall, I lived a good life, and I'm thankful for it. And yeah, I wouldn't have done it any differently. And yeah, so, this is kind of the objection that Tim raises against Alex, that Alex can't prove that in, every single case, the animals wouldn't kind of endorse the life that God had given them, looking back from this afterlife perspective. So yeah, in principle, I think this is actually a really good response to the problem of animal suffering, because you're building into your model of God this afterlife where animals are given this higher degree of consciousness and God gives them blessings sufficient to justify the kind of suffering that they endured, to the point where they would even happily endorse the kind of suffering that they went through because of these blessings that they received from God. And so because of this principle, there's no longer a mismatch that gets generated in expectations. We no longer have that expectation that God would not create a world with animal suffering. And so there's no longer this internal consistency, at least not on Tim's model of God. So problem solved, right? Not quite. So in an impressive turn of events, Alex actually begins to put Tim on the defensive, and he gets the upper hand. Alex begins naming example after example of horrendous animal suffering in nature, and he kind of incredulously asks why a loving God would create the world, in such a way that such suffering is built into the evolutionary paradigm, and like whatever blessings that you try to use to justify the existence of that evil, why couldn't God have given them those blessings without first having to subject them to this kind of suffering? And so here, Tim begins to try to offer an explanation in terms of kind of like their martyrdom and how God praises them for their martyrdom, and then the exchange goes on a little bit longer. But then eventually the majority of Christians in the audience decide that he's losing, and then they vote him out, and then the conversation's over. So things started off going really well for Tim, and then it kind of all just went wrong. So how did we get to that point? So after the video was released, Tim explained on Inspiring Philosophy's channel that Alex kind of employed this sleight of hand here by shifting the conversation from God's justification for animal suffering to God having reasons for permitting animal suffering, or it somehow being necessary for animals to suffer. And this is a very important distinction because here Alex is demanding for God to have good reasons for permitting animal suffering, whereas for Tim's response to this formulation of the problem of evil, he doesn't need to give an account of why God permits animal suffering or even whether animal suffering is necessary. All he has to do is get God off the hook and say that God's not a bad guy for permitting animal suffering. And so he's kind of introduced this principle for, making animal suffering justifiable, morally justifiable. And all Tim is trying to do is to craft a model of God where there's no internal contradiction. There's no expectation mismatch between what we expect from God and what we actually see in the world. And so, Alex kind of, raises points that are not really part of Tim's response. But even so, I don't think this is exactly a case of kind of, Alex winning the debate by employing cheap tricks or rhetorical strategies. I think there is actually a salient point of disagreement between them. I think there are two of them, in fact. So first, Alex is incredulous about the fact that an animal who has gone through tremendous suffering would look back on its life and, whatever benefits that it might get from God in the afterlife, that animal would look back and say that they wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Surely, and this is kind of, I'm imagining what Alex would say, surely, these animals would have preferred to live a life without suffering. Why would they endorse a life with suffering when God could have given them the same blessings without that suffering? And here, Tim might say something like, oh, this is just kind of personal incredulity, and that's not an argument. You have to show that, it's impossible for these animals to, endorse the life that they had. And then here, Alex might say, oh, I don't have to show that it's impossible. I just think it's unlikely. And then, Tim can say, oh, but how can you show that? How would you know the subjective states of animals in the afterlife? And then so it just becomes kind of a, tossing of the burden of proof back and forth at each other, which is pretty much kind of a stalemate here. But I think the second point of disagreement between them is kind of more relevant here. So technically, Alex can grant that Tim's model of God is internally consistent, that it kind of removes this expectation mismatch, and fully addresses this particular formulation of the problem of evil. But even so, Alex can still say that Tim has not resolved the problem of evil. Why is that? Okay, so the problem of evil is not one single argument, but it's a family of arguments. And Tim here is only responding to one formulation of the problem of evil. And then this formulation might be something like, every model of God is internally inconsistent. And then so Tim, by presenting a model of God that is internally consistent, successfully rebuts that formulation of the problem of evil. But that formulation might not be the one that troubles Alex the most. So based on some of his remarks in his exchange with Tim, it seems to me that Alex is actually fixating on God's love as a great-making property, and he is kind of implicitly assuming that any viable model of God must be perfectly loving, and a perfectly loving God wouldn't allow animals to suffer unnecessarily, and, so, there has to be some account of, why God would allow animals to suffer evil if he didn't have to. And then, of course, Tim repeatedly clarifies that on his account, on his model of God, he doesn't have to give an explanation of why God permits animal suffering. All he's trying to do is get God off the hook for allowing animal suffering. But yeah, that's kind of not Alex's main concern either. What he wants to do is like find a satisfying explanation for the seeming gratuitousness of animal suffering. So on his view, a perfectly loving God wouldn't allow animal suffering if he doesn't have to. Tim's model can be kind of internally consistent, and it would not generate an expectation mismatch. But then like Alex can come back and say like, well, okay, that's fine and dandy, but that's not a perfectly loving God, and so that's not a viable model of God. I don't have reason to take that model seriously. And this is part of what makes apologetics so hard. Sometimes you can offer a rigorous academic refutation of a particular formulation of an argument, but you're still not really able to convince the other person because you haven't given them an answer that satisfies their doubts. So it seems like what Alex wants to hear is some account that he himself would find plausible for kind of what reasons God has for permitting animal suffering, and why the goods that are achieved through animal suffering are so important that God would find it worthwhile to subject these animals to so much suffering. And that's not something that Tim was able to offer him. And so Alex wasn't satisfied with his response. What Tim did was give a clever response to a particular formulation of the problem of evil, which is significant in its own right, but it's not something that really moved the needle for Alex. But even in spite of all that, all hope is not lost. Tim may have been literally and metaphorically kicked out of this dialogue with Alex, but I'm sure he'll go back and kind of, reflect on what the source of disagreement between them was. And then he'll come back and, bring some more important insights on the problem of evil for us to mull over. And who knows, maybe one day Alex will be convinced by one of those reasons that Tim brings forward.